Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show that cuts through the noise to get you truly well-informed. Today we're diving into something pretty complex, the social and religious shifts that unfold in postcolonial contexts. You know, we often hear the broad strokes about these transformations, but what happens when you really dig into the nuances? Into people's actual lives and beliefs during these huge changes. So this deep dive, it draws from a really fascinating academic text. It explores the Islamic revival in Egypt, and it focuses specifically on women's experiences within the Piety movement. It kind of unpacks how these big historical forces, political changes, and theoretical ideas about things like agency and freedom actually play out in everyday life. Our mission here is to pull out the most important insights from this really rich, layered topic, give you a shortcut to understanding it, and hopefully we'll hit on some surprising facts and different perspectives that might, challenge our assumptions a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And our goal for you today is really to gain a much deeper understanding of the motivations, the complex realities behind what often gets slapped with labels like religious fundamentalism or traditionalism. We'll explore how individuals, particularly women in this case, navigate their faith, societal expectations, and also their own personal aspirations amidst these really dynamic shifts.
Okay, so let's set the stage then. Starting with the historical backdrop, our source describes this palpable sense of disappointment among the feminist left. This is in countries like Pakistan, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, right after colonialism. They had initially found a lot of intellectual grounding, sort of nourishment and critical Marxism and feminism.
That's right. And that sense of stability, it was really eroded, especially in Pakistan, under the military dictatorship of Zia-ul Haq. That was 1977 to 88. He explicitly used Islam to prop up his pretty brutal hold on power. And there's this fascinating geopolitical angle, too. He turned Pakistan into a frontline state for the U.S. proxy war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And this alignment, it gave his regime huge military and monetary advantages, which, well, it effectively stifled any real organized opposition.
Now, what's really interesting here, or maybe concerning, is that Zia's top-down Islamizing policy, it wasn't just politics, was it? It sort of seeped into everything, media, education, especially the judiciary, and it included laws that discriminated against women. So in that kind of environment, how did the progressive leftists at the time try to explain why the masses, as they put it, were turning towards these Islamic forms of sociability?
Well, the source lays out several explanations that were common then among those circles. Sometimes, it was attributed to maybe a perceived lack of education. Other times, the blame was pointed towards a more conservative kind of Saudi Islam brought back by immigrant laborers returning from the Gulf. There was also this idea of mimetic effects, basically, that Zia's repressive regime kind of inadvertently pushed people towards adopting similar forms. But a key explanation, one that came up a lot, was this idea of an unholy alliance. This was between Western capitals, specifically American, and the oil-rich Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE. The argument was that this alliance actively helps conservative Islam, around the Muslim world, specifically to defeat progressive movements. It really does highlight how complex the external forces were beyond just what was happening internally.
Right. It's never just one thing, is it? Now, when we talk about social movements, the word resistance gets thrown around a lot, but our source offers a really a thoughtful critique of how we usually understand agency and resistance.
It does. The author challenges that tendency we sometimes have to sort of romanticize all forms of resistance. Seeing them automatically as signs that power is failing, or just proof of the resilient human spirit. Instead, drawing on the work of Leila Abu Luqud, the source suggests we should maybe use resistance more as a diagnostic of power, like a tool, really, to see where and how social relations are shifting, rather than just seeing it as simple defiance.
Okay, a diagnostic of power. That's interesting. Can you give us an example? What's that mean in practice?
Sure. The source uses this example of young Bedouin women wearing sexy lingerie. Now, one might instinctively look at that and say, okay, that's resistance against parental authority, against dominant norms. But Abu Luqud suggests it could also be read as, reinscribing alternative forms of power. Forms rooted in capitalist consumerism, urban bourgeois values, certain aesthetics. So the insight is, resistance isn't always just pushing back. Sometimes it's a window into how power itself is shifting, adopting new forms, not just being overthrown.
That complicates the picture quite a bit. And it makes me think about how we view choice and freedom generally. Our sources get into these different liberal ideas of autonomy, like procedural versus substantive autonomy, and even historical paradoxes, like the British in colonial India tolerating sati widow burning if they thought it was willing. So how does all this help us understand individuals within these movements, especially when their choices don't really fit our maybe liberal expectations?
Well, the author also brings in Judith Butler's work here, which, as you know, radically challenges that traditional split between biological sex and social gender. Butler argues that gender discourse doesn't just describe reality, it actually constitutes it. It helps make it real. And the core idea from Butler here is quite profound, really. Instead of seeing societal norms as just limiting us, she suggests they're actually the very framework that enables our agency. So for Butler, norms aren't just external constraints. They're the necessary ground, as she puts it, through which someone realizes and acts out their agency. The author of our source wants us to move past this kind of simple doing versus undoing norms idea. Instead, they encourage thinking about all the ways norms are, quote, lived and inhabited, aspired to, reached for, and consummated. It shifts our focus. We start looking at the imminent form a normative act takes and the kinds of authority it relies on. It allows for a much more nuanced view of what people are doing, even within seemingly restrictive frameworks.
Okay, that framework is really helpful. And this internal logic, this way of living norms, it brings us right to the heart of our deep dive, the Dawa movement in Egypt. First off, what does Dawa actually mean? And how has it evolved?
Right. Dawa literally means call, invitation, appeal, or summons. It's a Quranic concept, mostly associated with God's call to prophets and, well, to all humanity to believe in Islam. Classically, it didn't get a huge amount of doctrinal attention, but it saw extensive elaboration, really starting in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And a daya, that's simply someone who practices dawah.
And what's really illuminating is how the movement critiques certain aspects of modern Egyptian society. We hear from one woman, Haja Samira, at the Nafisa Mosque. She speaks passionately about what she sees as a threatened religious sensibility. She laments how Muslims, in her view, emulate Westerners, the secularists, and the Christians, even in small things like smoking or home decor. And she asks this question, we are Muslims in name, but our acts are not those of Muslims. It's quite pointed.
Yeah, and this leads to a really key distinction made by people like another figure, Haja Faiza. It's this idea of translating worship into everyday practices so that all of life is directed towards God's will, not just, the basic religious duties like prayer or fasting. They explicitly criticize what they call the folklore of Islam, where it just becomes ceremonies like you mentioned, hanging lanterns during Ramadan or baking special cookies for feasts. It loses its ethical function, they argue. Haja Nur makes a similar point about the veil. She faults those who wear it just out of habit or custom. She argues that cess ignores how veiling is supposed to be integral to cultivating modesty in all aspects of life, not just dress.
So it's really about a deeper, more conscious engagement with faith, something that goes beyond just the outward appearances or traditions. Now, our source notes that increased literacy in mass media have made ordinary Muslims more familiar with doctrinal concepts. Some scholars see this as leading to an objectification of the religious imagination, but the author pushes back on that a bit, right?
Yes, exactly. The author questions if this objectification is really universal. While acknowledging, yes, modern conditions mean ordinary Muslims are more familiar with doctrinal reasoning than maybe in the past, they resist the idea that this always leads to some uniform, objectified religiosity. Instead, they emphasize the complex motivations, the different interpretations happening among individuals. And this connects to the modern doctrinal justification for dawah. Key figures like Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abduh, sort of the intellectual forebears of the Islamist movement, they significantly expanded the concept. Rida, for instance, insisted that modern knowledge, history, sociology, psychology are actually necessary for doing dawah effectively today, even though, obviously, those subjects didn't exist in early Islamic history.
Right, bringing modern knowledge into it. And that specific reinterpretation you mentioned earlier, shifting dawah to an individual obligation, that sounds incredibly significant. How did that shift actually practically open doors for new people, especially women, in ways that might have been unexpected?
That's precisely it. Rida asserted that dawah is fard alain, which means it's an individual obligation. It falls on every Muslim man or woman. It's not just a collective duty, fard kifaya, left to the scholars. And this reinterpretation just radically opened up the space for women to participate and even to lead in dawah. You couple that with rising literacy rates, increased social mobility for women in post-colonial Egypt from the 50s onwards, including, importantly, women specializing in religious subjects at Al-Azhar University itself. Well, it led to this dramatic increase in women joining the movement, claiming Islamic tradition right alongside men. It's actually quite striking. The source mentions many dawah training centers run by Islamic nonprofits. They often have more women enrolled than men.
More women than men, wow. And what really stands out here is how women became so central, actively engaging in religious teaching, religious pedagogy, even in ways that seem to challenge existing norms. The source highlights this controversial practice where Hajj Faiza leads women in collective prayer even when a male imam is present nearby. Apparently, she breaks customary norms by doing this, and hundreds of women gather to pray with her during Ramadan. So how did the state react to this kind of growing influence?
Well, that immediately brings up the question of authority, doesn't it? And the state's response. The Egyptian state, which the author characterizes as secular liberal, clearly views the Piety movement as a rival, a challenge to its own authority in a way. So as a result, laws were passed back in 1996 specifically to control dawah activities, things like nationalizing mosques, requiring preachers to get 2 years of state training and licenses, and even, reportedly, recording women's mosque lessons to check them for objectionable content. It clearly shows the state trying to regulate, to control what it sees as a powerful, independent social force.
So there's that whole political dimension, but beyond that, our deep dive also explores these fascinating internal debates within the Piety movement about ritual, about ethics. We meet Mona, a mosque participant, who is helping a younger woman struggling with the morning prayer, Fajr. And Mona frames the struggle not just as laziness, but as ghafla, a kind of carelessness or negligence towards God. She connects these daily actions directly to one's spiritual state. And she emphasizes things like controlling anger, being patient, seeing these as acts done for God. She even suggests this will actually make daily life easier, not harder.
Exactly. And this resonates with this understanding of piety as a really complex kind of disciplinary program. The goal is to make all acts close to God. And qualities like sincerity, humility, virtuous fear, or awe, khasha, or taqwa, they become just as important as performing the ritual in the correct outward form. It's fundamentally about transforming your inner world, your emotions, your dispositions, not just going through the motions.
Which is such a stark contrast to how Mona Hilmi, the liberal columnist mentioned in the source, viewed ritual. For her, rituals should prepare you for free thinking, for enlightened criticism. She saw transforming love for God into continuous self-criticism and even innovative revolutionary thought against subjugation. It really seems like a fundamental disagreement about what rituals do, what they're for, how they shape the self.
Precisely. And the source draws this interesting parallel to debates in Renaissance England about Protestant prayer, where formalized public prayer with specific bodily gestures and postures wasn't just seen as an outward performance. It was seen as a vehicle for inward change, for cultivating devotional attitudes. It highlights this almost universal theme, doesn't it? This deep interdependence of body and soul in forming character and shaping our moral disposition.
Yeah, that connection between the inner and outer. And this leads us to another key concept, malaka. It's a term influenced by Aristotle, but also used by Islamic thinkers like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun. What exactly does malaka mean in this context?
Malaka is described as a firmly rooted quality, something acquired through repeated action, through discipline, until it becomes like a permanent feature of your character. You could think of it like a deeply ingrained habit, maybe, or second nature. It's how sustained practice makes faith, as the source puts it, a perfect ability of the soul. So the implication is that our actions aren't just external fleeting things. They actively shape us. They ingrain qualities within our inner self. It's this idea that moral character is something cultivated, built over time, not just something you're born with.
Cultivated, right. And another powerful aspect of this cultivation we see is around emotions. Haja Samira, the popular daya we mentioned, she's known for evoking a specific kind of fear in her lessons. But it's not meant to be paralyzing, is it?
No, absolutely not. It's a very specific kind of fear, khasha or taqwa. It's often translated as awe or God consciousness. The point is to motivate you to seek forgiveness, to draw closer to God, not to terrify you into inaction. It serves to remind listeners of maybe unintentional sins they commit just by being absorbed in daily life, and it prompts behavioral change. So it's about transforming moral character, using these evocative, emotional techniques, not just dry, scholarly instruction. This emotional cultivation is seen as crucial for shaping a truly pious self.
Okay, shaping the self through emotion. And finally, let's talk about modesty, or al-haya. How do the pietists understand this virtue, and how does their view stack up against other perspectives in the sources?
Well, for the mosque participants described, modesty is deeply, deeply tied to bodily practices. It's essential in creating a pious subject. It's seen as encompassing an entire manner of existence, not just clothing. And this contrasts quite sharply with figures like Muhammad Sayyid Ashmawi, presented as a liberal Muslim voice. He argues that modesty is an attribute of any decent and wise person. It's an interior quality, he says. And for Ashmawi, it's not dependent on external things like wearing the veil, which he views basically as just a regional custom that got mistakenly elevated to divine status. Very different perspectives there.
Very different. And this deep dive really shows how these big ideas about norms, agency, piety, they crash right into people's deeply personal struggles. Let's look at the lives of some of the women navigating these spaces. One really striking example is the predicament of single women in Egypt.
Yes, Nadia, one of the mosque participants, speaks very clearly about what she sees as an injustice. Basically, single men are often assumed to be unmarried by choice. Maybe they're focusing on career, whatever. But single women, they're often seen or fear being seen as unwanted. She says it is very hard and a killer. It requires, in her words, a very strong personality, just to avoid internalizing this feeling that there's something deeply wrong with you.
That sounds incredibly difficult. And Nadia's way of coping involves this virtue of saber or patience. But this is another point where different viewpoints really clash, isn't it?
It really is. Nadia defines saber as persevering through difficulty without complaint, seeing it as being mindful of God's rights over you. She uses the powerful example of Ayub, who is Job in the Judeo-Christian tradition. His perseverance, she points out, didn't lessen his suffering, but it transformed how he lived through his pain. So for Nadia, saber isn't about passively accepting individual suffering. It's about actively doing the right thing in the path of God, even when it's hard.
But then you have Sana, a secular friend of the author, who critiques Sabes precisely as being passive. For Sana, a strong personality means self-esteem, self-confidence, drawing pride from her work, not valuing herself based on whether she's married or not. She asks pretty directly, where does Saber get you? Instead of helping you to improve your situation, it just leads you to accept it as fate passively. It just highlights this fundamental difference in what agency even means or what constitutes being a strong individual.
Absolutely. These contrasting views really lay bare different frameworks for understanding freedom, self-worth, how to navigate hardship. Another really powerful example is Abubir. She's being pressured by her husband Jamal to give up her Dawa studies. He uses sarcasm. He uses religious arguments against her participation. He even threatens polygamy, marrying another wife to try and force her to stop.
Wow. But Abir doesn't just accept it, does she? She counters him, even in front of family. She says something like, you keep insisting on this right God has given you to marry another woman. Why don't you first take care of his rights over you? And she is referring to his own laxity in prayer, and apparently it worked. What does that tell us about how her persuasion functioned?
Well, it shows that Abir's argument was effective not just because she was being assertive as an individual. It worked because Jamal shared her underlying assumptions. He shared that commitment to their underlying assumptions. Things like belief in the hereafter, belief in God's wrath for habitual disobedience. It was, as the Thorst puts it, a collaborative achievement. It was structured by this shared matrix of background practices, sensibilities, and orientations. Her power, in that moment, was rooted in the very tradition he also professed. That made it hard for him to just dismiss her point.
That's fascinating. It wasn't just her individual will, but the shared framework. So what about women whose husbands are, well, impious or not engaged in the movement? Our source talks about the Dayat's advice in those tricky situations.
Yeah, it seems most the women preachers acknowledge this inherent contradiction, this difficulty of living with an impious husband if you're deeply committed yourself. They generally advise women to try persuasion first, naturally. But if that fails, the advice is often to remain in the marriage, with the understanding that in Islamic jurisprudence, women are generally not held accountable in God's eyes for the actions of their adult male kin, including husbands. Some even frame this lack of accountability as a kind of blessing for women. It frees them, in a way, to pursue their own piety without having to constantly worry about or answer for their husband's conduct. The implication, though, as the source notes, is pretty significant. Potentially half the population of married Egyptian women might be considered impious by these movement standards if their husbands are lax.
Okay, reflecting on everything we've covered, this deep dive has really offered such a rich, multi-layered look into the Islamic piety movement in Egypt. It shows so clearly how history, these big theoretical concepts, and very personal individual experiences all intertwine. We've seen how ideas like agency and tradition, they aren't static things. They're lived, they're debated, they're transformed in really surprising ways.
Absolutely. From things like Zia-ul-Haq's top-down Islamization efforts in Pakistan to Rashid Rida's redefinition of dawah as an individual duty for everyone, we've explored that dynamic tension between political power and these grassroots religious movements. And crucially, I think, We've seen how central women are to this revival, how they're navigating incredibly complex ideas, modesty, patience, ethical self-formation, and often in doing so, they're transforming the very norms that might seem, from the outside, to define or constrain them. It's just such a powerful reminder that what looks like tradition, or maybe even resistance from a distance, is often this incredibly complex, active engagement, people shaping themselves, shaping their society from within.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Considering how the piety movement we've discussed critically engages with what they call folklore Islam, the customs divorced from deeper meaning and how they emphasize the intention and the lived practice behind rituals, what might this tell us about our own unexamined habits and customs, whether they're religious or secular or just cultural? How might we apply that kind of deeper scrutiny, looking at the intention, the lived ethics, to our own daily acts? And what might that reveal about our own underlying motivations and maybe the ethics we're unknowingly enacting every day? Something to think about.